Since the conflict in Ukraine erupted, the shadow of nuclear war has once again cast itself over Europe, forcing the world to confront a troubling future. The United States and Russia, the two leading superpowers with vast nuclear arsenals, seem to be entering a new arms race, focusing on the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons. These moves not only escalate global tensions, but also remind us of the 5 times the world has stood on the brink of nuclear war. These events marked peak tensions during the Cold War and illustrate the fragility of global peace, as just one small mistake could lead to an unimaginable catastrophe. So, how did these events unfold? Let's explore them now. Going back to the 1950s and 60s, the latent conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union began during World War II, when the two countries allied against fascist powers. However, their relationship was always tense. The Americans were wary of Soviet communism, while the Soviets were outraged by the U.S. refusal to recognize them in the international community. After World War II, this resentment transformed into hatred with the U.S., believing that the Soviet Union planned to dominate the world, while the Soviets were angered by Washington's interference in international relations. Against this backdrop of hostility, numerous indirect conflicts occurred, the most notable being the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when the U.S. Navy discovered 4 Soviet submarines escorting nuclear-armed warships in the Caribbean. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. Navy was unaware that each Soviet submarine carried 22 nuclear torpedoes, each with an explosive yield equivalent to the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Many members of the Soviet crew were prepared to use nuclear weapons if ordered by Moscow, marking the closest humanity has ever come to self-destruction. The situation began when the U.S. deployed 15 PGM-19 Jupiter missiles in Turkey, capable of striking Moscow. In response, the Soviet Union swiftly moved missiles into Cuba, which Nikita Khrushchev viewed as a countermeasure to U.S. actions. Fidel Castro, eager to strengthen ties with Moscow, agreed to allow the Soviets to establish military forces on the island, which he considered a protective measure against U.S. intervention. The Soviets deployed over 20 R-12 ballistic missiles and 16 R-10 missiles, each capable of carrying nuclear warheads with a yield of 1 megaton. The situation escalated when a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane detected the locations of Soviet missiles in Cuba, heightening tensions between the two superpowers. Information about the Soviet missiles in Cuba was sent to the CIA, which then forwarded it to the Pentagon and the White House, serving as a cold shower for U.S. leaders. A high-level meeting was immediately convened to discuss response options. Ultimately, 3 main choices were presented: to attack the Soviet missiles before it was too late, to strike Cuba, or to completely blockade the island. The U.S. chose the blockade, intercepting 4 missile-carrying ships and 4 submarines. Tensions escalated, with both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, along with their NATO and Warsaw Pact allies, placing their military forces on high alert. Meanwhile, a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down by the Soviets, resulting in the pilot's death and extinguishing any hopes for a peaceful resolution. In the end, the crisis was resolved. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its troops and nuclear weapons from Cuba, while Washington promised not to attack Cuba and to remove its missiles from Turkey. The U.S. also began to adopt a more cautious approach. During the Cold War, any military activity, no matter how small, could lead to serious consequences. A typical incident occurred on the night of October 25, 1962, when a guard at a military base in Minnesota saw a shadowy figure and opened fire, suspecting it was a Soviet spy. An alarm signal was sent to other bases, resulting in 2 nuclear-armed F-16A fighter jet squadrons taking off to intercept the threat. At this time, the U.S. military was on high alert, and any mistake could ignite a nuclear war. Fortunately, the base commander was able to make contact and halt the planes, determining that the intruder was actually just a black bear. Another event happened on May 23, 1967, when a solar storm caused severe disruptions to the U.S. early warning radar systems. Radar systems in 3 areas of North America were affected, and any activity in these zones could have been interpreted as provocative behavior, potentially escalating tensions. Using information from the Solar Weather Center of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, meteorologists confirmed that it was indeed the sun causing the disruption, not the Soviet Union. As a result, a series of planned nuclear weapons deployments were halted, helping humanity avoid an unimaginable disaster. Without investments in monitoring solar activity and geomagnetic fields, the situation could have been much worse. From the late 1950s to the mid 1960s, the U.S. military began monitoring space weather to detect solar energy eruptions that could disrupt power grids and communication networks. If the U.S. made mistakes, the Soviets were not exempt either. In the early 1980s, amidst rising tensions, an incident occurred on the night of September 25th and 26, 1983. The Soviet early warning missile system falsely indicated that the U.S. had launched 5 missiles aimed at the Soviet Union. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, an officer at the control center, faced the grave risk of making a false report that could lead to a retaliatory nuclear strike. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov decided not to report the false missile launch warning, as he assessed that a genuine attack would involve more than 5 missiles, and there were no signs of an attack from ground radar. The error occurred because Soviet satellites misidentified sunlight reflecting off clouds as missile launches. The most tense event at the end of the Cold War took place on November 7, 1983, when about 100 senior military officers participated in NATO's exercise Able Archer 83. This exercise involved 40,000 troops from NATO countries and was designed as a realistic nuclear war scenario to test communication capabilities in transitioning from conventional warfare to nuclear conflict. At this time, tensions between the West and the Soviet Union were escalating. The Soviets feared that the West might launch a nuclear attack, especially as many documents from that period indicate that the KGB had initiated a campaign called Operation Ryan to search for suspicious signs of an impending Western attack. The exercise's proximity to real-world tensions led Soviet agents to suspect that NATO was preparing for a preemptive strike against Moscow. The Able Archer 83 exercise prompted a strong reaction from the Soviet Union, putting around 70 SS-20 nuclear-armed missiles on high alert. However, thanks to information from Agent Algolsky, the U.S. quickly recognized Moscow's concerns about a surprise attack. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher informed the U.S., leading to the decision to withdraw heavy and nuclear weapons until the exercise concluded. This exercise created tensions comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Following the event, NATO realized the need to inform Moscow about nuclear-related exercises to avoid misunderstandings. Tensions gradually eased as President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev embarked on arms reduction treaties. Which event do you find most striking? The Cuban Missile Crisis, the false alarm, or Operation Ryan? Share your thoughts in the comments below the video. Wishing everyone a great day.